Good afternoon, buenos dias, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of all of us at the locally based, independently owned bookstore, Books and Books in Miami, Florida, and in partnership with Miami Book Fair, it's my pleasure to welcome you to a virtual afternoon with Armine Kotin Mortimer to discuss her new translation of French author Christine Angot's novel, An Impossible Love, published by our friends at Archipelago Books. Christine Angot is one of the most controversial authors writing today in France. Since the 1999 publication of Incest, Angot has remained at the center of public debate and has continued to push the boundaries of what society allows an author to express. Armine Kotin Mortimer is the translator of Philippe Solaire's Mysterious Mozart and his Casanova the Irresistible, as well as Julia Kristeva's The Enchanted Clock. Excerpts from her translations of Solaire's novels have appeared in 3am Magazine, The Brooklyn Rail, The Cossack Review, and many others. Her long career as a professor of French literature occasioned many scholarly books and articles, as well as recognition by the French government with the Palmes Académiques in 2009. To moderate this afternoon's program, we're joined by Lynn Sharon Schwartz, the author of over 28 books, including the novels Disturbances in the Field, Leaving Brooklyn, and Rough Strife, which was nominated for a National Book Award. She's also written several books of poetry and essay collections. She has received grants from the Guggenheim Foundation and the National Endowment for the Arts, and she currently teaches at Bennington Writing Seminars. Just a quick reminder that throughout this afternoon's broadcast, you can post questions below in the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen. And please order your copy of An Impossible Love from Books and Books and support independent bookstores. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage. Welcome.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello. Hello. I'm very glad to be here. And looking forward to a discussion about Christine Angot with Lynn. I think the introduction that Christina just gave was very appropriate in mentioning the controversial nature of Christine Angot. She was born in 1959 in a small town in the south of Paris called Châteauroux. She's written quite a lot. She has published several novels. When she published the novel called Incest in 1999, she suddenly became very talked about and very successful. And since then also has been very active in media productions where she comments about other books and so forth. One of the things about her is she's very forthright. She's been described as brash, even abrupt and harsh in her comments and so forth and so on. So she's quite controversial in that sense. Personally, I admire that. I don't know about you, Lynn, if you feel the same way, but there's a certain, assertion in her, a feminist assertion perhaps, characteristic of her speech, which can be kind of explosive. But the interesting thing in her novels is that there is a central fact. Incest mentioned it. That was 1999 in a book translated by Tess Lewis and published again by Archipelago. And in that novel, she says that she, character named Christine, was raped repeatedly by her father. So there's a central fact of incest that has appeared in that book as well as in An Impossible Love, and also in the most recent book by her, which is called Le Voyage dans l'Est, The Trip to the East, literally, a book that won the Medici Prize. She writes in a vein that is autobiographical. You could call it autobiographical novels, but I prefer the term autofiction, even though she herself doesn't use that term or rejects it, but it's quite clear that she is telling her own story, the story of her life in fictional terms. But it is not safe to draw any conclusions about her life from the novels, nevertheless. She said in a recent interview that her books are not documents for the police. I thought it was interesting to say for the police. In other words, they are not testimony. She rejects that idea of a book being as testimony. She says she wants to be accurate, but at the same time retain her right to create the story she tells, both truthful and accurate, but not documentary. So it's a very hybrid form, and we call that autofiction. She can see the events of her life, she said, as if they are inscribed in a painting or a movie with scenes and dialogue. And she writes, she says, to see her own life more clearly. So in this book, An Impossible Love, she portrays herself and writes in the first person. She portrays herself as Christine, and she portrays the love of her mother and her father. The story begins as her mother and her father meet, and it continues to tell how their love develops, how they do not marry, but they do agree to have a child. The mother ends up having to raise the child on her own, and that child is Christine. The love develops between the mother and the child, and Christine is depicted in all the stages of her life and becomes eventually a grown woman. And the story ends when the mother is about in her 80s and the daughter is a grown woman as well, with a daughter of her own. I don't know if that gives an idea. Lynn, what do you think? What should I add to that?
Yes, no, I think it gives a very good idea. It's amazing how you're right. It ends, if the mother is in her 80s, Christine herself must be 60-ish, maybe what she is now.
Right.
And she doesn't, she's a very economical novelist. She doesn't say, now 10 years have passed. Now I'll tell you about my adolescence. Now I'm a young woman. You're just there. Suddenly she's living with a man. Suddenly she has her own child who she adores. It's sweet. Suddenly she and her mother are a year. It starts before she's born when her parents meet, and it covers a scope of maybe 60 years. But nevertheless, and it's a fairly short novel.
Yeah, but 215 pages. 215 pages for 60 years. That's
and short pages, and but it seems very rich. You don't come away thinking it's kind of one of those slim novels where you just get the bare bones of a subject. You get a great deal about the subject. Yeah. And one of my thoughts about it was that the manner in which it is told, is very unusual. It's very, very controlled. Unlike incest, which is like the ravings of a wild woman. If you have to read that. And this one, 20 years later, both the narrator and the character have matured. It's told in an almost repertorial style. Nothing about I felt this or I shuddered with emotion. Nothing like that. But suddenly, little by little, the facts come out. And the emotion the emotion of the reader is all the more powerful. The response when you realize, oh my God, this has been going on for years and I never knew. And the emotional pull of the book just grows and grows. It's very powerful.
Yeah, I agree. I want to read a little section that leads the reader to understand. There's a lot, as Lynn says, it's a lot of things, as you say, there are things that aren't told. In fact, some of the descriptions of the book talk about a horrible secret between the daughter and the mother. So they're not talking about it. There are lots of ways they're not talking about it until the fact comes out. A secondary, totally unimportant secondary character alerts the mother that the father has been sodomizing, I'm sorry to say, the daughter. And this has happened during a week's vacation that the 13-year-old or maybe 14-year-old Christine spends with her father. I'm going to read you a passage about that week's vacation. It's about 5 minutes. Pay attention to the words horrible and difficult, which occur in this. I think it'll be kind of interesting. My father invited me to spend a week with him in Strasbourg. His children still did not know of my existence, but they were leaving for Morocco with their mother for the Easter vacation. The apartment would be empty. When I returned, she came to get me at the station. I smiled vaguely when the compartment door opened. Each time I came back to her mother, things didn't seem to go well. I stepped down onto the platform with my bag on my shoulder. How did it go? Middling. Oh, really? Why? I never made negative comments. Why middling? It was difficult. Oh, what was difficult? He is difficult. But what? What in particular? His personality. I know. The conversation did not continue in the car. We arrived in Châtillon, and there in the apartment, starting from a small point, from a way I had of talking to her, a comment, a more aggressive tone than usual, to which she replied with aggressiveness, a crisis exploded. It finished in accusations, in shouting, until we both began to cry, both of us exhausted. We kissed. Then she held me tight in her arms. It did not go well, Mama. What happened? Did something particular happen? Well, for example, one day after lunch, we were going out for a spin. I was glad because since he was working, I would wait for him all day, and now we were going out. So I was happy. I was glad we were going to go out. He was in the hallway, and I joined him in the hallway. I went out into the hallway, and I shut the door. At that moment, he realized the key was inside, but I had shut the door. I thought he had taken the key since he was out in the hallway. There was no way I could know that it was still inside. And then, Mama, he began to accuse me. Mama, you cannot imagine the way he talked to me. He told me, you don't close the door when you're not in your own home, that it wasn't done, that it was rude when you were at someone else's house, that it was impolite, that I shouldn't have done that I wasn't at my own home. Do you realize, Mama? Do you realize how disgusting it was to say that to me? He talked to me like I was rotten fish. It was horrible. It lasted all afternoon. He kept shouting at me all afternoon. You cannot imagine, Mama. It was awful. It wasn't your fault, after all. You couldn't have known that he hadn't taken his keys. Right, but he kept saying it was my fault because... Don't cry, Christine. It's over. Tell me about it calmly. I went on. Well, he said that when you are at someone else's house, you don't go out at first. You don't go out first, but second, after the one who lives there. I said, yes, but you were in the hallway. He replied that had nothing to do with it. The fact that he was in the hallway changed nothing, that it was a matter of principle, that one doesn't close the door when one is not in one's own home. He said that I don't know how many times, Mama, that it was a matter of politeness, of education, that I should have known that it is a rule and all that I should have gone out second after him because we were at his house and not shut the door as if it were in my own home. So many times he said that to me. Do you realize how mean it was to say that to me, Mama? It was hard, all the same, to hear that for me. Yes, very hard. And how did all that end? Well, he called in a locksmith, and it cost a lot. He said it was my fault, and the day was spoiled. And afterwards, was it better, or was it like that all week? It wasn't very pleasant as weeks go, Mama. It was too long, maybe, don't you think? Yes. And also he went to work while I stayed home all day and I was bored. Yes, it was too long. And even also it wasn't good. Something else happened. What? Well, tell me. Well, see, in the morning, he would leave early. I had my breakfast after he left, and then he returned at noon. One day at noon, he came back, and I had forgotten to put the milk bottle back in the refrigerator after my breakfast. When he saw that the milk was still on the table, you cannot imagine how he talked to me, Mama. Because of a bottle of milk you didn't put away? Yes, he talked to me like I was rotten fish, like he hated me, screaming. He said, don't you know that milk goes sour? And he shouted, you don't know that? How come you don't know that at your age? The tone of his voice, his tone, Mama. It was horrible. It was horrible, Mama. There were horrible things. He said some things, horrible things, horrible. They were horrible things, Mama. Shouting loud, loud, loud. so loud. You don't know. You cannot even imagine. You cannot even imagine how loud he was screaming. Milk goes sour if you don't put it away. At your age, you don't even know that. And I said, yes, I do know that, but I just forgot. I didn't think about it. I didn't do it on purpose. I'm sorry. I didn't notice. And he stopped crying like a little baby girl because I was crying. I can't take it, Mama. I can't take it anymore. It was a hard week. It was too hard. It really didn't go well. Really not. It didn't go well at all, at all, at all.
Well, that's when we know the circumstances. That's a shocking passage. It became even more alive as you read it. It didn't go well. It didn't go well, and she tells these two, relatively trivial incidents. I mean, they seem trivial to us.
Yeah.
Whereas the main event that he was sodomizing her, she doesn't say at all. And later she says, toward the end, when they're old women, they have a conversation, and she asked me very near the end, almost the last page, how could you not know, Mama? And the mama says, I'll never forgive myself for that. And it's a wonderful description of people knowing and not knowing. Right. The mother sort of knew something was very wrong, but maybe she couldn't even think so far as to imagine this horrible, horrible thing that he was doing to her. And you used the word rape, and of course, I mean, she was unwilling, but this went on for 2 years, every weekend.
3 years, yeah.
And it wasn't, well, maybe more.
Yeah.
I don't believe it was like a rape. Somebody grabs you and forces you to the ground. Okay. And that's it. She never wanted it, but it happened all the time. And sometimes she would say, don't do it. And he would say, okay, I won't do it anymore. Yeah. But this is never really explicit. As explicit as it gets is in the passage that Armine just read. Yeah. This is a really masterful work. I should say mistressful work in the way it presents information. Don't you feel that?
Yeah, I mean, the repeated use of, things like it was hard, it was difficult, he was difficult, it was horrible. He was, all of the depiction of everything would correspond to what we know actually did happen. Rather than these two trivial things. And, you're very right, Lynn, to talk about how the daughter can't tell her mother. It's like trying to get the words out, but all she can do is say something else instead. And then also the mother doesn't want to see it. Towards the end, Christine asks her, how come you didn't see anything? And she says, the mother says, I can tell you I'll regret it all my life. And she also realizes, she uses the word blind. She was blind. I'd say deaf also, because in that passage, maybe you could have heard something worse.
This passage and the way he treats Christine, just aside from the incest, I mean, just the bottle of milk, I mean, these really idiotic little things that he picks on. Yeah. It has to do with what comes out at the end. Most explicitly, it's there all along in a conversation between the mother and daughter, that the reason they never got married was his unwillingness, but because of social class. It's really a book, in addition to incest, it's really a book about social class. The mother is not as educated. She's very smart. I mean, she, does, by the end, she's running a department in a psychiatric institute, but she's not educated. She's not cultivated. She makes mistakes in grammar, which he corrects. He practices while they're in bed. Right. And also she's a Jew. So he's from a very wealthy, prominent family. Right. He could never bring home a woman like that to his family. In fact, when his family, just in an ancillary way, it's not important in the novel, family learns about her existence and that she's pregnant, his mother says something like, oh, it's just one of these low-class girls trying to snag a rich man.
Absolutely.
It's certainly not. And this is, we can infer this ourselves by reading, but it doesn't come out in all its power until the last 6 or so pages, when the daughter gives the mother this really brilliant sociological analysis. It's a marvelous passage. of why
I-
he could never marry and why he's so arrogant. And he's a terrible guy. He has terrible traits, arrogant, self-involved, etc. And the mother, she doesn't, she sort of gets it, but she doesn't get it. In fact, I found a passage on page 101 where Christine is asking her, she's a young girl now, why didn't you get married with my papa? Because he didn't want to. And then the mother says, not in as sophisticated a way as Christine does later, he had a certain kind of woman he wanted. It was a social level, my family, my background, my situation. It wasn't what he was looking for.
Right.
So this theme, it's not that the mother never thought of it, but the mother doesn't have the kind of mind that the daughter does, which sees things in great sociological patterns and cultural patterns.
Yeah, that's so important. She says it's, this was his denigration. His name is Pierre. Pierre's denigration of Rachel, the mother, is not just you. It's a whole social thing. Absolutely. It's really interesting. He considers himself above the common. There's a wonderful phrase by Amanda Duffy, who wrote a review, a very good review for the Washington Post. She said he has an incredible, how does it go? A staggering sense of entitlement. He just, and so she's poor, she's uneducated, she doesn't have, she's Jewish, she has the sort of small town, doesn't have the sophistication, she has limitations from that, and so forth. So, and this is reflected very much in the writing. One of the things about translating was having to be attentive to the difference in their social rank, which is reflected in their language. As you said, she speaks sometimes with slight grammatical, well, in any case, colloquialisms. She uses a colloquial form of speech, whereas he's more likely to be, his sentences are well put together. And it's very obvious, especially in the letters that he writes, which are quoted to some certain extent.
It occurred to me, I don't know, I guess there's no way of knowing if this is true, but just as you said, I agree, it's autofiction. But I wonder if these many letters and emails are real, if any of them could have been, well, I guess we won't know this. And his letters are so cold, most of them, so cold and distant. When she says she's pregnant, he's very detached from the whole thing.
Yeah.
He's and the mother just doesn't see it that way. And the daughter, as we all ask, well, how could you love him? But she loved him.
As you say, it's artificial. I really wondered about the letters too, whether she's got the letters that her mother received and she's quoting them, but one can't really safely say anything about her life, about Christine Angot's life, on the basis of this novel. And in fact, she likes to blur the relation of fiction to reality. She says that's her intention. She believes there's a fine line between fiction and reality, and she makes her novels kind of straddle it. So some of it's, I think we have to take it as truthful, but she has to imagine dialogue, for instance. That's part of the way fiction is written.
Yes. Another thing about the two things about his sodomizing her, when she comes home from the weekends, especially in the beginning, you just need a drink. There's a gradual coldness and distance between her and her mother that develops. Earlier, she starts at, I think, about 14. Earlier, they've been very, very close. I mean, mother and daughter, it's beautiful in some ways, and it's a little creepy in others. They're always hugging and kissing, and they're very close because they have each other. That's who they have. And the more she sees him, the more distant she becomes. Yeah. And she makes it sound like, oh, he's so cultured. He takes me places. He teaches me things. But it's really that it's so confusing for her. He does do those things, but at the same time, he's raping her. And at the end, during these few last pages we've mentioned, Christine tells her mother that his taking advantage of her sexually was in a way to demean the mother, because not only was the mother poor and uneducated and Jewish, but this was another thing. She has his daughter and he can bring her low. They talk about bringing her low. So it's also kind of in him. Well, we don't want to even analyze him. We don't get into his mind at all.
Mhm.
But I guess somebody could write a novel about what goes on in the mind of an upper class rich man seducing a young woman like this. But the whole thing is even, she says, it's even a matter of class that he brutalizes her.
Right.
And she's his own child. And another thing is that I think it's when he starts giving the mother a monthly or quarterly amount of money, like alimony. Not because he has to, but he has a lot. And I think when she stops sleeping with him, she says at one point she's not going back, he stops giving her the money. And that was very telling. I just noticed that about the second or third time I read it. It's almost as if he's paying for the privilege of having her sexually.
Yeah, good point. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, in fact, the title, when you think about the possible meanings of impossible love, I could see at least three. And, we've got an impossible love. It really ought to be three impossible loves or something like that. I mean, first of all, there's the social love. The love between Pierre and Rachel is just unlikely. It's, they come from such different milieus. And then the love between the mother and daughter, just as you said, Lynn, becomes extremely, you're almost embarrassed to read some of it. The way the daughter, jumps on her mother's lap and hugs her and gives her kisses all over her face and so forth and so on. It's incredible closeness. And same thing when she starts to menstruate. Anyway, and then it becomes a difficult, they as you said, she gets very cold towards her mother and even starts to really almost to hate her. So that's also kind of an impossible love. But of course, the obvious impossible love is the one of the father for the daughter. And the daughter, who nevertheless wanted to see her father, because when she first meets him, she's so enamored of the things that he brings to her, the culture, the knowledge, the languages he speaks, and so forth and so on. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yes, I felt the same. After I read it, I thought, which impossible love does the title refer to? And then I realized it's all of them. It's all of them. And exactly.
Right. Anyway.
But she managed, in a short book, she brings together the theme of the sexuality, which is abhorrent, the social class, even the religious. It's not emphasized that she's Jewish. She's not particularly religious, but it's always there. As I think I'm not an expert on French society, but I think it's always there in that society. Well, anyway, I lost my train of thought.
No, well, yeah, the Jewishness definitely in their 50s. There's a certain anti-Semitic trend in France at the time, and so that was one more strike against Rachel, Russia.
Yes. Oh, and one that reminds me about her name. Her name is Rachel Schwartz, and that was her father's name. She had a bad experience with her father too, but we didn't have time to go into that. Her big pursuit throughout the book is to have Pierre acknowledge officially on documents that Christine is his daughter.
Right.
And he just won't. He won't. And finally, he promises to do it, then he reneges again. And after you don't get the details, a long night of maybe arguing and maybe sex, we don't know, he finally signs the papers so she can have his name. This is the mother's one achievement.
Absolutely. The interesting thing is when Christine is explaining the whole social quality of the situation with her father in the fantastic conversation with her mother at the end, she alludes to the fact that he committed incest with her as a further way to deny that he was actually her father, because fathers don't sleep with their daughters. Okay. Exactly. So socially speaking, he couldn't be her father, you know. So that was one additional, like the final turn of the knife in the wound or something.
Yeah, it's kind of like a maze, you know. There's so many twists and turns that, and it all eventually leads to this central fact of that this was, especially between the pair, an impossible love for so many reasons. And I'm interested in the mother, the kind of intelligence she has. She's certainly not stupid, and she's able to run a department, but it sort of shows and when you're not really educated, you're not able to grasp the larger picture of things that Christine has to explain to her.
Right. Yeah, she's very unsophisticated, the mother, and you know, even though she's managed her life very well, she supported her daughter and raised her and so forth and so on, and has, as you said, reasonably good job. And but yeah, the lack of sophistication, the lack of insight, which the daughter does possess, and explains it to her at the end. So anyway, I wonder, was there anything else you wanted to ask me about how it was translating?
Oh yes. Well, I translate from Italian, so I know French. I mean, I can read French, but I've never translated. But compared to your other work, did you find this? Nothing is easy, but was this easier, more difficult? How did you approach it as a translator?
You know, it's such a tough question to answer. It's not the same. That's all I can say. I can't say if it's more difficult or easier, really. I mean, the translating Solaire, Kristeva especially, have certain difficulties, but different kinds of difficulties translating this. You know, I'm going to give you one example. It was one I'm particularly proud of how I solved the problem. When there's a character who finally tells, you know, puts the word out there, tells Rachel that Christine's father is sodomizing her, she comes down with an infection of the fallopian tubes. Okay, so the word for tubes in French is trompe, Trompes. And that is the same sound, the same root as the word to deceive or be wrong, etc. Tromper. And détromper is to be undeceived. Okay, so the daughter in French says to the mother, "Oh, you were détrompé, you were undeceived. You know, your eyes were open because you had this infection of the trompe." That she makes a pun on the sound of the word for the fallopian tubes, which sounds like being undeceived. So what did I do? You know, we can't say, you know, these are fallopian tubes. So what did I wrote? What did I write? What kind of infection was it? An infection of the fallopian tubes. As if by chance, says the daughter. The tubes. Your illusions had just gone down the tubes. That was how I solved that problem.
That's a great feat. I didn't know that about the two words, and I see now I'm full of. It's too bad you can't explain how you did it.
You know, I mean, some of the worst things that a translator faces is translating a pun or a joke or something, you know, that just doesn't work. So when you find one like that, you say, yeah, yeah, I got that. I just thought another thing I should point out is sometimes Christine writes long sentences. I'm talking now about the author. Christine Angot writes long sentences. In fact, the first sentence in the book is about 4 sentences all strung together with commas. We call that comma splices in English. I turned them into about 2 sentences, I have to confess. And at other times, they're short and repetitive phrases. Right at the end of the conversation in which Christine makes the sociological analysis of the situation, the mother says, I'm going to read a little bit here. It's that, you see, how can I say it? I really would have liked to keep intact the memory of the good times I had with him. We had some really good times. We spent some good times, you know, the two of us. We had marvelous times, really. We had times, really some beautiful times. A weekend in the Creuse region, a marvelous week at Beaulieu-sur-Mer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I would have liked to keep the happy memories, but there you have it. That's how it is. And starting from the moment when I couldn't keep the memory of the very good times we've had, I preferred not to think of them at all. We had some very good times, et cetera, et cetera. So in other words, that kind of writing is not hard to translate, but you sort of worry about wearing out the reader with such repetition. But that's how she writes. So one is, I believe in being very faithful to the original.
Yeah, I didn't notice. I mean, I read it, but it didn't strike me with a full force until I just heard it aloud from you.
Yeah.
And that in a way, well, it was, of course, let's say maybe 50 or more years ago, so she might not remember everything. But I think that is the way an unsophisticated person would remember. Like we hear about people talking about high school, oh, we had some really great times, a really good time. But
Yeah.
what? But what? Whereas a writer, always goes for the specific. If she were a sophisticated woman, she would say, there was this one night when we did blah, blah, blah. But the general is, a way of, I think, also evading, and she is an evader, evading the truth. They have some good times. But what about the times when he said, I can't marry you. It's just, I'm not going to do it. And she doesn't want to remember that. And she accepts it.
Right.
Yeah, she accepts it. And then when he does finally marry a German woman whom Christine kind of mocks. And when she meets her, it's very brief. I want to go into the translation of that too. But he tells her he's married, but he's not really married. He won't be married until 6 months from then. But he lies to her. And later she sends him away and there's a rupture between them.
Yeah.
But later when they get back together a little bit, he says, well, it's just one of these little lies. You pay too much attention to these things. But there's a moment with Christine toward the end. She's a grown woman, I think. She meets the father's German wife.
Right.
And they just have a very brief, pretty meaningless conversation. Oh, where the wife talks about she identifies herself with Nazis who are torturing Jews. And here she is taking the man away from her mother. I mean, the most spectacular, the most hyperbole beyond words. How did you handle the pronunciation? She speaks a funny English and she must speak a funny French.
Yeah. So that's interesting because you had to stop and think about what does a person, a German native, say, German speaker, sound like in speaking with an accent in English. It's different. The sounds are different. So I had to go over that. There were many iterations. I had to try out lots of different things. I checked it out. I have a very good writers group. They were helpful, just hearing how it sounded and so forth. I'm wondering if we shouldn't go to questions. See?
Yes,
here I am.
Hi, Christine.
So yes, I was struck, just going back to Lynn's point and the repetition, I was struck by it in your first reading, where she kept saying it was a very difficult time. It was a very difficult time, but she couldn't say why. She just kept repeating the same thing. Oh my God, what a gripping reading that was. So we have a few questions here. And I'm not entirely, so someone is asking, does the gap also represent the differences between urban and rural? And I guess that pointing to the gap in classes, or I'm not sure. Okay.
Oh, no question. I mean, he's Paris. In fact, he describes his neighborhood as near the Eiffel Tower. I mean, it's, a very, very high-class neighborhood of Paris in particular. He's got deep Parisian roots. There are times in his letters, his job sends him to another city, and he doesn't really want to go there because it's so far from Paris and things like that. So it's very much the urban, yes, definitely for him. And she, of course, in this very small town, and her house reflects her poverty, by the way. It's totally rural. The laundry is done in a house, in a building. I mean, just off the, not in the main house. In fact, there's no bathroom in the house, etc. Things like that. So Christine, as a 3-year-old or 4-year-old, can walk home from school by herself, and neighbors keep an eye on her just as she walks by, and so forth and so on. So it's very much the difference between the city and the small town. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and there we should add that at one point, the Pierre when they're lovers, suggests that the mother, Rachel, move to Paris, live in an apartment, and they could still be lovers. And he would, of course, have his work, and he couldn't see her too much. And he wouldn't even mind if she got married. They could keep up their affair. And of course, she says no. And she, at some point, she does realize what a life, what an awful life that would be. She'd have nothing there but him once in a while. I mean, she's not used to big city. You know, look, live as my mistress.
Right. Yeah, I agree.
Can you tell us more about Christine Angot, please? And then this is connected to another question about, has she read your translation? And did you consult with her as you were doing it? And how long did it take?
Oh, I don't remember exactly how long it took. You know, when you translate, you do the translation, and then you spend months maybe revising. So you go back over it and you think it's done, and then you go back over it again and you change things still. So I can't answer the question of how long it took. I didn't consult Christine Angot. I don't know if she knows about it. I assume she does, because it's a publication, and you know the rights were obtained to publish in English. So I'm sure she knows about it, but and I have no idea if she's happy with it or not. It's lovely when the author writes back and says, "I love your translation," but I haven't heard from her, so I can't answer that. What was the first part of the question?
Can you tell us more about her?
Oh, about her. Well, she is also very involved with theater, in addition to things I mentioned before. And she acts. Oh, by the way, she also has read her books aloud. So an audiobook is available of Un Amour impossible in French. There's also a movie of this book, by the way. Not sure what to highlight about her. She's very visible, very active right now in a lot of kind of quasi-intellectual talk show type things on television. Very media presence, a lot of media presence. And she's not, main thing is she's really not afraid to speak her mind, and can be very forthright, something that I both like and understand that's very controversial.
Yeah, I don't, you know more about her life than I do, but I would say that I think you mentioned the word feminist, Armine, earlier. I would say she definitely, whether she pronounces it, professes it or not, because most of the men in the 2 books that I've read, they don't behave well at all. Right. All the men in incest, the people's father, Rachel's father is missing, and they didn't have a good relationship with him. Yeah. There are a lot of missing men. There are women prominent, but the husband seems to have disappeared somewhere.
Yeah.
How did you choose this book to translate?
I was extremely lucky. I met Tess Lewis, who translated Incest, for Archipelago, at the conference of the American Literary Translators Association about 2018, perhaps. I'm not even sure what year. And she mentioned that Archipelago had asked her to translate this book, Un Amour impossible. And she said, well, she wasn't too keen to do it. She had a lot of other work. And so I simply wrote an email to Jill Schoolman at Archipelago and said, I would like to translate this book. And I did that even though I hadn't read it, which was taking a bit of a risk, but I knew of her work. And I had read about 2 or 3 other books. I had read Incest also. And that's how it came about. And if there's anybody out there who is a publisher, I also want to translate the most recent book, Le Voyage dans l'Est, The Trip to the East, which won the Médicis Prize, which is about the second most important prize in France. It was also nominated for the Goncourt Prize, which is the first most important book prize in France, and that was published in 2021. I would definitely like to translate that, and it is very much about the incest.
And you've translated Julia Kristeva, which is remarkable.
Yeah.
How how interesting. How long did it take you to translate An Impossible Love? How long did you work on it?
I can't really I didn't bother to write down when I started and when I finished, as far as that goes.
Mm-hmm. Someone would like to know, do you have other translations in process?
I actually have, yes, several. I won a National Endowment for the Arts Translation Fellowship to translate a book by Catherine Cusset, Cusset. Very interesting novelist. The book is called A Brilliant Future. And I have translated it using this grant, and I'm still looking for a publisher. I also have Lynne, who was the founder of the Louvre Museum under Napoleon, during Napoleon's reign. And got a couple of other projects that are not as current, let's say.
Fantastic. Okay, well, thank you. That takes care of the questions that we have from the audience. As I was listening, I couldn't help thinking of an American author named Catherine Harrison. Are you familiar with her work?
No.
She wrote about her incestuous relationship with her father in many, many books.
Oh, yes, Catherine Harrison. Yes,
Catherine Harrison. The most famously a book called The Kiss, which was also very controversial in its time. It was published a while ago.
Yeah, she did that. She wrote a novel about incest, in which there's incest, and then a few years later, she wrote the memoir, and I thought that the novel was much better. I don't know why. It was somewhat long ago. I can't give you reasons why, but
me too. I read it a long time ago, but I remember it impressing me. Greatly.
They were both impressive, but unless you're a very, very great writer, it's very hard to write good autofiction.
Anais Nin is someone else who came to mind.
Autofiction, in my view, autofiction seems to be almost the dominant genre in France these days. I mean, people are just writing their stories, but calling them novels, and that's the way they are.
And so,
Philippe Forest, I forgot to mention my work on Philippe Forest. His last name is spelled exactly like Forest. Philippe Forest, he wrote a book called The Eternal Child, which I have translated, and I'm also looking for a publisher for that book. He writes about his life, but with the strategies and the tools of fiction.
I want to connect you to another translator that I know, Valerie Miles. If you remember, just to reach out, I'd like to make that connection. I think the two of you might have, be able to help one another since you're looking for a publisher. There's one more question that just came in. Were there French equivalents to the American pejoratives for working class whites, white trash, trailer trash, hillbillies that were directed at the less well-educated characters in the book?
Those terms didn't occur. I mean, the equivalent terms in French didn't occur in the book, I don't think. Instead, there was as Lynn was saying earlier, there's a great economy she doesn't interpret, she doesn't analyze, she tells. So describing the house, for instance, makes it perfectly clear that this could be, I suppose it could be called white trash. Very poor house, badly in need of repair. There are a couple of rooms you can't even go into. When the only room that's heated is the kitchen, there's no bathroom. She heats water to wash herself in the kitchen sink. I mean, okay, hillbilly, yes, but the word is not used. There's no analysis of this. It's a simple description.
Yeah, I think the class system in France seems different
Yeah.
from ours. I don't know if they have what the equivalent of hillbillies or white trash. It seems it's a very different kind of society.
Right.
And we have yet another question that just came in. I am curious as to how the nature of autofiction changes the reading of the text. Rather than changing characters' names and leaning into the book as fiction, Angot chooses to keep her autobiographical details in the novel, and it seems like a clear statement. How does this change or affect the reading of the text, despite her insistence that the book is not meant as documentary evidence? Is it for shock factor, or do you think it's doing other work?
Doing harder work?
Other work.
I don't know. I find it impossible not to think about the author. If she says I something and I this, that, and the other, yeah, definitely. But as I said, it's not safe to draw conclusions about the author's life from the book, and that's true. I worked a lot with the work of Serge Dubrovsky, who was the creator of the term autofiction, as well, and Philippe Soler is also somewhat autofictional in his novels. But if you want, you can read what it says in Wikipedia about the author and see how much it is similar to what it says in the book. But there's a kind of voyeurism, let's face it, reading an autofiction, and it's enjoyable because it's a novel that's written with dialogue and events, and the narration progresses. There's a storyline, so you read it like you read fiction, but at the same time, you're constantly thinking about what happened to the author, or what the author did, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, it's a lovely kind of reading. I really enjoy it. It's a hybrid reading.
This also made me think a lot of Dani Shapiro and her memoir about finding out that she was not really her father's daughter, and the fact that she went on to found a podcast about secrets, just all the secrets that families keep, and the emotional inheritance of those secrets. Anyway, this has been a fascinating afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for supporting Books and Books by being here. To everyone watching, remember, all you have to do is click on the green button to order a copy of An Impossible Love from Books and Books. And if you're in Miami, you can come by any one of our stores and get it there too. Thank you both for joining us. I hope that we will see you in Miami sometime soon.
Yes.
And
thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Christina.
Thank you.
Thank you to everyone watching and joining us. And thanks to Archipelago Books. Keep publishing these wonderful books. Thank you. Bye.